Welcome, or welcome back, to the second of two lectures by John Mearsheimer, titled Realism and the Rise of China. The background to today's talk is Professor Mearsheimer's 2001 book, The Tragedy of Great Power Politics. If you are a student or scholar of international relations, you already know the importance of this book and that realism is one of the principal schools of international relations theory, with legendary scholars such as Hans Morgenthau and Kenneth Waltz. If I tell you that this book is the Bible of offensive realism and the realist theory today, you might think I am exaggerating. Therefore, I will leave it up to Samuel Huntington's opinion of this book from the cover page. Samuel Huntington says, late Samuel Huntington of Harvard University says, this book ranks with and in many respects supersedes the works of Hans Morgenthau and Kenneth Waltz. All serious students of international affairs will have to come to grips with its argument. Since we are in Turkey, let me just add a sentence that unfortunately it is a tragedy that the tragedy of great power politics has not been translated into the Turkish language. Unlike Professor Mearsheimer's other recent books on the subject, such as Lying in International Politics and Israel Lobbying U.S. Foreign Policy. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor John Mearsheimer.
Thank you, Sam, for the subject I want to speak about today is the rise of China. And I want to ask a specific question. And that question is, can China rise peacefully? And my answer to the question is no, that China cannot rise peacefully. And I want to tell you why. But before I get into the specifics of my argument, I want to put two caveats on the table. First, you want to understand that I am simply assuming that China will continue to grow economically over the next 20 or 30 years, much the way it's grown over the past 20 or 30 years. I'm not saying that that will happen for sure. And in fact, there are a good number of people who think that China is not going to continue to grow in the future the way it has in the recent past. I don't know what the answer is. We're just assuming here that China is going to continue to grow. So that's point number one. Point number two is, the only way you can answer the question of whether or not China will rise peacefully is with a theory. It has to be a theoretical question because we have no facts about the future. The future hasn't happened yet. So, for example, when I hear people in Washington say that they have just been to Beijing and they've talked to person X, Y, and Z, and after talking to persons X, Y, and Z, they're convinced that China can rise peacefully, I say this is a bunch of poppycock. I don't care what person X, Y, and Z told you. Person X, Y, and Z will probably be dead in 20 or 30 years, and the people who will be running China in 20 or 30 years are probably 15 years old today. And you don't know what they're going to be thinking in 15, 20, 30 years. You don't even know who's going to be running the country in 15, 20, or 30 years. Can you tell me who's going to be running Turkey in 30 years? Can you tell me what Turkey's strategic environment is going to look like in 30 years? No, you can't. Right? So this is a theoretical question. Right? And this is why IR theory is so important. Okay, now to the heart and soul of my talk. 3 parts. First, I'm going to give you my basic theory of great power politics. 2, I'm going to give you a synoptic view or a synoptic telling of American foreign policy since the founding of the country in 1783. And what I'm going to try and do in describing American foreign policy over the history of the country is convince you that my theory explains how America has behaved over time. Because anytime you lay out a theory, it's very important that you give people some confidence that the theory has explanatory power. So what I'm going to do is tell you in the second part of the story how America has behaved since 1783, all for the purposes of trying to convince you that it fits neatly with my theory. Then the third part of my talk is where I explain to you what I think China will do as it turns itself into a giant Hong Kong. And my argument, of course, is that I believe that China will also act the way the United States has acted. China will imitate the United States because that's what the theory says. The theory would expect China to behave much the way the United States has behaved. And of course, I can't just talk about what happens when China rises and how China behaves. I also have to explain how I think the United States will react to an ascendant China. So again, you see there are three parts to the talk. One is the basic theory, then two, history of American foreign policy, and then three, how China is likely to act in the future, and how the Americans and actually China's neighbors will react. Okay, so those are the three parts of the story. Let me start off with my basic theory of international politics. And I'm sure some of you are reasonably familiar with the argument, but for those who are not, I'll go over it in some detail. I start with 5 simple assumptions about the international system. I'm a structural realist, and I believe that when you look at the structure of the international system, you look at 5 assumptions. These assumptions tell you a great deal about how international politics works. The 5 assumptions are, first, that states are the principal actors in the international system, and there's no higher authority that sits above those states. As many of you know, this is what we call anarchy in political science speak. Anarchy. Anarchy does not mean murder and mayhem in the IR lexicon. Anarchy simply is the opposite of hierarchy. It's just saying that states are the principal players in the system, and there's no higher authority that sits above states. States are like pool balls on a table. That's the first assumption. The second assumption is that all states in the system have some military capability, some offensive military capability. Now, that offensive military capability varies across states. Belgium obviously has very little offensive military capability. Jordan obviously has very little offensive military capability. Germany, on the other hand, Israel, on the other hand, the United States, on the other hand, those are countries with a heck of a lot of offensive military capability. But nevertheless, Belgium and Jordan do have some limited offensive military capability. All states have some offensive military capability. That's the second assumption. The third assumption is of enormous importance, and I want to spend a little bit of time dwelling on it. It has to do with intentions. Remember, the second assumption had to do with capabilities. The third assumption has to do with intentions. And there, my argument is that states can never be certain about the intentions of other states. And the reason that you can never be certain about the intentions of other states is that intentions are inside people's heads, and you can't get inside people's heads and see their intentions. Very different than capabilities. During the Cold War, when I was young, like many of you in the audience, during the Cold War, we used to be able to measure Soviet capabilities. We could count how many armored division equivalents they had, we could count how many SS-18s they had, how many attack submarines, how many Bear bombers. These were material capabilities that we could see and count. We had huge debates throughout the Cold War as to what Soviet intentions were. It was very difficult to figure out what Nikita Khrushchev or Brezhnev was thinking at any particular point in time. And furthermore, we didn't know really who was in charge in the Kremlin. So how could we divine what Soviet intentions were at any particular point in time? Intentions are uncertain. Take this a step further. Even if you don't agree with me on that point, even if you think that we can figure out what the intentions of another country are right now, my trump card is to say, you cannot tell me what the intentions of another state will be in the future. There's no way you can know future intentions. You cannot know whether another state will have malign intentions or benign intentions. And this is not simply because intentions are in people's heads and hard to measure. It's because the future hasn't happened yet and you don't know what their intentions will be down the road. Let me give you a really good example that has nothing to do with international relations that illustrates this point. And it's actually a very depressing example. It has to do with divorce. Anytime two people get married, they invariably think that the person they're marrying is wonderful and is going to have benign intentions towards them forever. Otherwise, you wouldn't get married, right? But obviously, at least in the United States, we have a very high divorce rate, which means it doesn't work out. And in many cases, the person that you marry ends up, over some extended period of time, having malign intentions towards you. And if you think about this, when you get married, there's no way you can know for sure that the person you're marrying won't turn out to be Attila the Hun, and that you won't end up in a War of the Roses-like situation. This is not to say you can be certain it will happen. It's just to say you cannot be certain that the person you're marrying won't eventually have malign intentions towards you. Very depressing, but true. But the same thing is true in the international system. If it's 1919 and you're the Allies at Versailles and you're trying to think about how to deal with Germany over the long term, how can you know what Germany's intentions will be in 1929 or 1939 or 1949? How can you know that in 1919? It's not that you can know that they will have malign intentions, you just can't be sure. So the first three assumptions I've laid out for you is, number one, that the system is anarchic, which simply means there's no higher authority. Number two, all states have some offensive military capability. Varies across countries, but all states have some. And number three, you can never be certain about another state's intentions. In my opinion, you can't be certain now, and you certainly cannot be certain in the future. Okay? Those are the first three assumptions. The fourth and fifth assumptions are straightforward. The fourth assumption is that survival is the highest goal of all states or all countries. It's not the only goal, but it's the highest goal. For the obvious reason that if you don't survive, you can't pursue any of the other goals. If you get killed, you can't do anything else because you're dead. So survival always has to be the number one goal. Fifth assumption is that states are basically rational actors. They're strategic calculators. All of this is a way of saying that states are quite good at coming up with reasonably smart strategies for maximizing their chances of surviving. So those are the five basic assumptions that I make about the world, about the international system. Now you take those five assumptions, you put them in the blender, and you hit the on switch, and you mix them up, and you get three forms of behavior. The first is fear. All states in the system fear every other state in the system. The level of fear varies across states, but states fear each other. And they fear each other for two reasons It'll be obvious to you once I spell them out. First of all, they fear each other because there's always a possibility you'll end up next to a state that has a lot of offensive military capability and malign intentions. There's always a chance you'll end up next door to Nazi Germany or Imperial Germany or Imperial Japan. The second reason that states fear each other is that if you get into trouble, there's no higher authority that you can turn to because it's an anarchic system. You know, in the United States, when you get in trouble and you want to dial the police, you dial 911. I like to say there's no 911 in the international system. You dial 911, you know who's at the other end? Nobody. Nobody. There's nobody to call. And that leads to the second form of behavior, which is self-help. States quickly figure out that in the international system, because there's no 911, because there's no higher authority, and because you fear other states, you have to take care of yourself. As I like to say, God helps those who help themselves in international politics. The third form of behavior that you get is you quickly figure out that the best way to survive in an anarchic system where you can end up living next door to a troublemaker, the best way to survive is to be really powerful. To put it in colloquial American terms, to be the biggest and baddest dude on the block. You'll be really powerful. Because if you're really powerful, nobody messes around with you. It's one of the great things about living in the United States. We have the Canadians to the north, the Mexicans to the south, fish to the east, and fish to the west. Nobody in America goes to bed worrying about any country attacking it because we are so powerful. In other words, if you're interested in survival, as I told you, survival has to be the principal goal. If you don't survive, you can't pursue those other goals. If survival is your principal goal, you're in an anarchic system where you can't be certain about the intentions of other states, and they may have one heck of a lot of offensive capability. You want to make sure you have a lot more offensive capability than that. You want to put it in political science speak, maximize your relative power. To put it in slightly different terms, you want to be the hegemon in the system. Now, very important here, I'm not arguing that you want to be the hegemon of the system so you can go on a rampage and beat up other countries. You want to be the hegemon of the system because that's the best way to survive. So that's what my 5 assumptions take you to. They take you to the conclusion that the best way to survive is to be the hegemon of the system. Now, I want to unpack a bit what it means to be the hegemon of the system. I believe that it is impossible to be a global hegemon. The globe is too big, and there's too much water. And it's very difficult, in my opinion, to project power across water. So you cannot dominate the entire globe. I believe that the United States has gotten itself into a lot of trouble since 1989 because it has mistakenly thought that it could be a global hegemon. My view is that the best you can do is be a regional hegemon. You can dominate your region of the world. I'll talk more about this in a minute, but the United States of America dominates the Western Hemisphere. Imperial Germany tried to dominate Europe. Imperial Japan tried to dominate Asia. So my argument is the ultimate goal for any state in the system is to be a regional hegemon. That's number 1. And number 2 is you want to make sure that no other state in the system dominates its region of the world. In other words, you don't want Germany to dominate Europe. Now you're probably saying to yourself, I can understand why he says that you want to dominate your region of the world. But who cares about whether another country dominates another region of the world? In other words, why should the United States care whether Germany dominates Europe or China dominates Asia? The answer is that if a country dominates its region of the world, it is free to roam. It is free to roam into your backyard. I often say to American audiences, have you ever thought about why it is that we, Americans, run around the entire world sticking our nose in everybody's business? You ever wonder why that's possible? The answer is because we have no security threats in the Western Hemisphere. There's no country in the Western Hemisphere that is a military threat to the United States. So we are therefore free to roam. And you, Turks, are well aware of how much roaming we do. There's no place on the planet you can go where people are not aware of our ability to roam. Well, if you're the United States of America, you do not want Germany free to roam. Why? Because it'll roam into the Western Hemisphere. You want Germany to be pinned down in Europe, worrying about the Russians, the French, the British, and whoever else you can concern them with. The same thing is true with the Chinese. We do not want a China that is free to roam the way we are free to roam. So again, given my 5 assumptions, what you end up with are 2 goals. The first goal is to dominate your region of the world, 1. And 2, make sure that no other country dominates its region of the world, because then it's free to roam in your backyard. To put this in Pentagonese, that's a foreign language we speak in the United States. To put this in Pentagonese, you don't want a peer competitor. Okay? That's my theory. Now, what I want to do is give you a thumbnail sketch of American foreign policy from 1783 up to the present. And what I want to convince you of is that our behavior fits very neatly with my theory. When the United States got started in the late 18th century, it was comprised of 13 small colonies strung out along the Atlantic Ocean. Over the course of roughly the next 60, 70 years, the United States marched across the continent, stole huge amounts of land from the Native Americans, murdered huge numbers of Native Americans in the process, went to war with Mexico, and stole what is the southwest of the United States from Mexico. We invaded Canada in 1812 because throughout the 19th century we had our gun sights on Canada and believed that Canada should be part of the United States. The reason Ottawa is the capital of Canada and Toronto is not the capital of Canada is that Toronto was very close to the American border, and the Canadians thought we were going to pay them a return visit, and they didn't want their capital to be conquered. So they put it in Ottawa rather than Toronto. Furthermore, we would have expanded into the Caribbean if we could have, but we could not because of the slavery issue. As you know, there were lots of slaves brought to the Caribbean because that's where the sugar industry was concentrated. And sugar, tobacco, and cotton are labor-intensive industries that required lots of slaves. Therefore, the northern states in the United States were adamantly opposed to conquering territory in the Caribbean because they thought that would result in more slaveholding states coming into the Union. That's the only thing that prevented us from conquering territory to our south. And as I said to you, we would have gone further north. But we went all the way from the Atlantic to the Pacific, and we created a very big and very powerful state. And then we opened the gates to immigrants who came in and filled that country up. That's the first thing we did. Second thing we did is called the Monroe Doctrine. In 1823, old President James Monroe told the European great powers, "This is our hemisphere. You're not welcome here. We're not powerful enough to throw you out now, but we're eventually going to throw you out. And after we throw you out, you are not welcome back here." It's the Monroe Doctrine. First part of the story was all about manifest destiny. That was where we conquered a huge chunk of North America and created this state. Second part was the Monroe Doctrine. That was getting rid of the Europeans once and for all. By 1898, in the wake of the Spanish-American War, we had established regional hegemony in the Western Hemisphere. We were, and still remain, the only regional hegemon in modern history. That was done on purpose. There is no country in modern history that has a record of conquest that looks as good as ours. It is no accident that Adolf Hitler admired the United States of America greatly. He said, "These are people who know how to create Lebensraum." The United States is a ruthless great power. It always has been. So that's the first thing that we did. Right? We created hegemony in the Western Hemisphere. As you know, I said there's a second thing that a great power wants to do to maximize its relative power, and that is to make sure it has no peer competitor. Fortunately, there were no potential peer competitors in the 19th century. In the 20th century, there were 4 potential peer competitors: Imperial Germany, Imperial Japan, Nazi Germany, and the former Soviet Union. The United States played a key role in putting all 4 of those countries on the scrap heap of history. As I told you, the United States will not tolerate peer competitors. We do not. We're number one, and we plan to stay number one. That's the way we operate. We don't talk like that. We have all these liberal rhetoricians who tell stories about our great values and our belief in freedom and so forth and so on. But that's all just liberal cover for what is basically ruthless behavior. We do not tolerate peer competitors. In World War I, when it looked like Imperial Germany was going to win the war, we entered in April 1917. If I had another 2 hours, I would make the argument that we provided the tipping mechanism that allowed the Allies to prevail in that war. We helped finish off Imperial Germany, and then at the Treaty of Versailles, we defanged Germany for at least the next 15 years. World War II, we played the key role for sure in defeating Imperial Japan, and putting that country on the scrap heap of history, and we contributed to defeating Nazi Germany in Europe. The Soviet Union, of course, played the key role there. And then when the war in Europe ended in 1945, and the Soviet Union emerged as potential hegemon in Europe, the Cold War ensued. The United States played the key role in containing the Soviet Union and then ushering it down the toilet bowl in the late 1980s and early 1990s when it fell apart. The United States was glad to be rid of the Soviet Union, just as it was glad to be rid of Nazi Germany, just as it was glad to be rid of Imperial Germany and Imperial Japan. Again, we do not tolerate peer competitors. And in fact, shortly after the Cold War ended, the administration of George H.W. Bush wrote some defense guidance that was leaked to the Washington Post, which made it clear that the United States viewed itself as the most powerful state on the planet by far, and that it had every intention to remain the most powerful state on the planet. That's the way international politics works. Most countries, of course, don't have the wherewithal to behave the way the United States does. But if you do have the wherewithal, what you discover is that great powers expand, and they try to dominate their region of the world. That's what the United States did. Brings me to the third part of my talk, which is, what is China likely to do? My view is that China is going to imitate the United States. And remember, what we're talking about here is a situation 20, 30 years down the road where China is much more powerful than it is today. China is a paper tiger militarily today. It's not a very powerful state militarily. And we're talking about a situation where China turns into a giant Hong Kong, and then it translates that economic might into military might. First question you have to ask yourself is, do you think China's going to try and dominate Asia? Do you think China is going to want to be the most powerful state in Asia by far? For me, this is not even an interesting question. The Chinese remember what happened the last time they were weak. It was not pretty. The European great powers and Japan invaded China, carved it up, did all sorts of horrible things to the Chinese people. They would have been much better off, those Chinese, if they had been really powerful. But they weren't powerful, they were weak. If you're China and you have two choices, one is you're 10 times more powerful than Japan, that's one option. Or two, Japan is 2 times more powerful than you. Which do you think you take? Do you think this is even an interesting question? Chinese want to be really powerful. They're going to go to great lengths to dominate Asia. What they want to do is they want to write the rules in Asia the way we write the rules in the Western Hemisphere. This does not mean that China's going to go on a rampage and try and conquer every country in the region. No, that's not going to happen. What China's going to try and do is make sure it is by far the most powerful country in Asia, and that no other state has the military capability to threaten it. China's going to want to create a situation where it's surrounded with the equivalent of Canada and Mexico, because that's the best way to survive. And what about the Monroe Doctrine? You think the Chinese are going to have a Monroe Doctrine? I think they are. By the way, the Japanese explicitly had a Monroe Doctrine of their own in the 1930s. They talked in exactly those terms. You think the Chinese are going to be happy with a situation where the United States runs aircraft carriers and airplanes up and down their coastline and has troops stationed right off the Chinese mainland? Think the Chinese are going to be happy with that? We're not happy. Whenever a European great power moves military forces into the Western Hemisphere. When I was young and the Soviets used to put military forces in Cuba, it drove the United States of America stark raving crazy. Who are these Soviets to come into the Western Hemisphere? This is our hemisphere. That's what the Monroe Doctrine is all about. Well, my mother taught me when I was a little boy, what's good for the goose is good for the gander. And if we have a Monroe Doctrine, and we don't want great powers wandering into our backyard, why do you think the Chinese are going to be happy with the United States sitting on their doorstep? They're not going to be. They're going to do everything they can to push us out of Asia, push us out into the Western Pacific. Is that because they're evil? Of course not. It's because they're going to figure out, if they haven't already figured out, that the best way to survive in the system is to be really powerful. It's to dominate your neighborhood and not have other great powers on your doorstep. So in this hypothetical situation where China gets to be much more powerful than it is today, it's going to be inclined. It's going to be inclined to push the United States out of Asia. Now this brings us to the question of, how do you think the Americans are likely to react? We have a rich history here, and the history coincides with my theory. And that is to say, the United States does not tolerate peer competitors. We will go to great lengths to make sure that China does not dominate Asia the way we dominate the Western Hemisphere. You all know that last year Barack Obama decided that we were going to pivot to Asia. Is this surprising? Is this surprising? No, you know, the United States tells the Chinese that our pivot to Asia had nothing to do with containing China. Nobody with a triple-digit IQ would believe this. Our pivot to Asia was explicitly designed to contain China. The United States is determined to make sure that if China continues to rise and begins to throw its weight around in Asia, as we expect it to, that we will be there to contain them. Because again, we do not want China to dominate Asia. What about China's neighbors? You can already see what's happening with China's neighbors. They are very nervous about a rising China. And we now have very good relations with Vietnam, which we fought a war with in the 1960s and early 1970s. Very good relations with Singapore, India. I often ask students, why is it that the United States has excellent relations with India today and had bad relations with India during the Cold War? And students will say, oh, it's because India is a democracy and America is a democracy. But that argument doesn't work, in large part because India was a democracy during the Cold War and America was a democracy during the Cold War. Yet they had bad relations. They're both democracies now and they have good relations. So it can't be the fact that India and America are both democracies that explains the good relations today. What explains the good relations today is China. The Indians live in mortal fear of the Chinese. And the Chinese and the Americans are beginning to come together because they both fear China. The balancing coalition that's going to come together to contain China is going to include the Russians, it's going to include the Indians, the South Koreans, the Japanese, the Singaporeans, Vietnam, the Philippines. That'll be the balancing coalition. Now, the problem that you face in this situation is that anything we do and China's neighbors do to contain China will look like encirclement to the Chinese. To put it in slightly different terms, anything that we do for defensive purposes will look offensive to the Chinese. And of course, anything that the Chinese do to defend themselves will look offensive to us and to China's neighbors. As many of you know, this is the classical security dilemma. The classical security dilemma says that what one country does to defend itself appears to the other country to be offensive in nature. So what's going to happen here as China continues to rise and it begins to exercise its muscle and it begins to build military forces, what it thinks are for defensive purposes. It's interested in survival after all, it's for defense. What it does for defensive purposes will appear to us to be offensive in nature. And anything we do, again, this is containment, anything we do to contain China will appear to them as offensive in nature. Again, it will look like encirclement. So my argument is that as China continues to grow economically, and it translates that economic might into military might, you are going to get an intense security competition between China and the United States, and more broadly between China on one hand and the United States and China's neighbors on the other. It's going to look a lot like the Cold War. Not completely, but it's going to look a lot like the Cold War. It's going to be a very dangerous security competition, which is going to have significant potential for war. Let me conclude by saying that story I have told you revolves around my theory of great power politics. Again, I don't think you can answer the question whether China can rise peacefully without a theory. So my story is based on my theory of international politics. But as many of you in the audience know, all of our social science theories are rather crude devices. We do not have a body of really good theories. And what that means is that sometimes our theories are wrong. My theory is not right all the time. My gut instinct is that my theory is right about 75% of the time. And 25% of the time, my theory is wrong. This is just the way social science works. What this means is that the story I told you might be wrong. I don't think so, but I think there is a small chance that my theory is wrong. Given what a grim story I just told you, let's hope that my theory proves wrong in this case. Thank you. I will be happy to take questions. And I would just ask that anybody who asks a question, you just stand up and even identify yourself. And if you keep the question or the comment to 1 minute, that would be good, because that way we can maximize the number of people who ask questions. Sir.
I'm Mearsheimer from Üniversitesi. Today we heard a lot of states, structure, realism, material structures. But yesterday I was on the other hall and listening to you, and you were mentioning, you are putting emphasis on domestic actors and guiding American foreign policy. So do we see an inconsistency here? How do you explain it?
Yeah. I'll repeat the question, and you tell me if I got it right. Yesterday I talked about the Israel lobby, and that was a case where domestic politics was the principal driving force in the story. And basically, the story I tell with Steve Walt in the Israel lobby and U.S. foreign policy is a story that contradicts basic realist logic as John lays it out. How do I reconcile this contradiction? Excellent question. Everybody has it? The answer is I cannot reconcile this contradiction. And in fact, this is a wonderful question to ask at this point in time, because it gets back to my closing comment that my theory sometimes doesn't work. My theory, as should have been clear to everybody here, places little importance on domestic politics. But the fact of the matter is that occasionally, not often, but occasionally, domestic politics matters a lot. And when domestic politics matters a lot, the theory doesn't work. That's what you're highlighting. So that is part, exactly, you just said part of the 25%. So the lobby is part of the 25%. That's correct. Let me just say a word, especially since there's so many students in the audience, about theory. The world is enormously complicated. And we cannot make sense of the world. This is whether you're an IR theorist or not. We all need theories to make sense of the world. And theories are simplifications of reality. You just heard me give you my theory of international politics. It's a simple theory. My critics would say it's a simplistic theory. But be that as it may, it's a simple theory that says a handful of factors really matter. And what I am doing is leaving out all sorts of other factors. Apropos your question, I'm leaving domestic politics largely out of the story. But occasionally, domestic politics matters a lot. That's the Israel lobby case. And when domestic politics matter a lot, my theory is going to be falsified, or it's not going to be able to explain the case at hand. That's the 25%. There's no way that any social science theory, given the complicated world that we face, can explain every case. Whenever I hear somebody say, I have a theory that accounts for every case, it's a perfect theory, I say, this person can't be serious. You can't have a perfect theory. The world is just too complicated, and theory by definition is a simplification of reality. And occasionally those factors you leave out of your theory are going to jump up and bite you on the hiney. And that's what happened in the case of the Israel lobby. But I just want to make one more point on his excellent question. My retort to this question is that if you don't behave according to realist logic, you get yourself into a lot of trouble. And in fact, the story that I tell about the lobby is that the United States, because it has pursued this foolish set of policies in the Middle East, because the lobby has so much influence in the United States, has gotten itself into a lot of trouble. And this is why I argue that the lobby is ultimately pushing the United States in the wrong strategic direction. So my advice to you is that you always want to behave according to the dictates of Realism 101, because that maximizes your prospects of survival. Yeah. Yes.
Thank you for your brilliant speech. I really appreciate it. And I'm IR student, third year study at Koç University. In your talk, you referred to the unipolarity of the world. And I would like to end this hegemon state, which is like bullying everyone. Do you think that unipolar world is like more safe, makes world more safe place? Or is the balance of power needed?
Did everybody hear the question? Okay. I'm not sure we live in a unipolar world, but for the purposes of discussion, I'll accept your characterization of the world as unipolar, okay? So the world is unipolar, and obviously the unipole is the United States. Is the world safer? In one way, the answer is unequivocally yes. And that is that if you're in a unipolar world, you only have one great power by definition. One pole, unipole. That's the United States. So you can't have great power versus great power wars. If you have the United States and the Soviet Union, or Germany, Britain, France, England, the United States, you can have great power wars because there are great powers that can fight other great powers. But in a unipolar world, there's only one great power. So you can't have great power wars. And in that sense, the world is much safer. If China begins to rise, and my story proves to be true, then you can have a great power war. And that is a very depressing thought, because great power versus great power wars are very deadly. So in that sense, unipolarity is more peaceful. The problem that you have in unipolarity, and your comments got at this, is that there's no other great power to check the unipole. And if the unipole is like the United States and wants to run around the world remaking other countries in its own image. You remember the Bush Doctrine? Remember the Bush Doctrine? Most people have forgotten it. Probably some of you are too young to remember it. But the Bush Doctrine basically said that the United States was going to use its military to invade countries in the Middle East and do massive social engineering at the end of a rifle barrel. We were going to democratize the entire Middle East. Iraq was just the first stop on the train line. I mean, the Bush Doctrine, of course, crashed and burned in Iraq. So we never got to do Iran, we never got to do Syria. But That was the intent of the Bush Doctrine, to remake the entire Middle East. And when you have a country like the United States that is so powerful, and there's no other great power to check it, and it has that imperial impulse, you're going to get a lot of wars. Do you realize that the United States of America has been at war for 2 out of every 3 years since the Cold War ended? 2 out of every 3 years. Right? And there's still a few more years to go in Afghanistan. And we're talking about, you know, maybe intervening in Syria and maybe going to war against Iran. So in that sense, the system is not more peaceful.
You mentioned my name already. My name is Attila. You mentioned Attila.
Attila, but not Attila the Hun.
I'm peaceful though.
This is the peaceful Attila.
Okay. I have a question on the structure of your theory, and maybe challenge the third axiom. What you call assumptions are basically the axioms of your theory.
Correct.
And you should not challenge, you should not question them and accept them. However, to be axiom, neither should be derivable from the others. So I challenge the axiom 3 about intention, because that's derivable or in contradiction with rationality. Because what are intentions? Either they, I think, are usually derivable from rationality, or if they are not derivable from rationality, they are in contradiction with rationality.
Yeah. This gentleman's point was that if you look at my third assumption, which had to do with intentions, and you look at my 5th assumption, which is where I assume that states are rational actors, or what we sometimes call strategic calculators, there's a tension there. Because I said you can't know what intentions are, and he's pointing out that I'm saying that intentions are rational. We know they're rational. Okay, is that a fair summary of your statement? Okay. Long term. Yeah. When I said that states are rational actors, it had nothing to do with intentions. It was all about instrumental rationality. Okay? In other words, when I write about rationality, you talk about 2 forms of rationality. One is whether your ultimate goals or your intentions are rational. And then the second meaning of rationality is instrumental rationality. That is where, given a particular goal, do I behave in rational ways to achieve that goal? Okay? So the question is, number 1, is the goal rational? And 2, is my behavior to achieve that goal rational? My assumption about rationality is all about instrumental rationality. It's all about being rational in pursuit of survival. Okay? With regard to intentions, I'm saying nothing about whether they are rational or not, because in fact, I don't believe you can make an argument as to whether or not intentions are rational or not. But intentions are all about a different kind of rationality in your lexicon. Is that clear? Okay.
Hi, Sean McMeekin from the History Department. So I'm not a theoretician, obviously, what you might call a hopeless empiricist. But that said, I'm willing to grant.
He said he's a hopeless empiricist. It's impossible to be a hopeless empiricist. Everybody has theories in their head, even historians. The only difference between historians and political scientists is we acknowledge that we have theories and they deny it when in fact.
Well, I was actually going to confess that I did find a lot of your theory quite plausible. And yes, of course, I am going to propose a counter theory. But no, I find it plausible as regards the past. If you look at US foreign policy, you can absolutely see this dynamic of kind of, as you put it, a ruthless, great power interest maximizing power. But how do you account for the more recent behavior of the United States? I don't just mean the Israeli lobby, as you see, or the endless wars in the Middle East and so on, but something like the fiscal profligacy, where the United States is now effectively paying for China's entire military budget simply with the interest payment on the bonds that China has. Or the southern border, for example, which effectively has now been subcontracted out to Mexico's government pursuing a reconquista. Does there ever come a point where a great power can be described as, I guess, Freud, here's a theory, Freud would have called it a death instinct, a kind of a suicidal hegemon trying to will itself out of existence? Is that possible?
Yeah, this is a very good question. His point is that the United States in recent years has done a number of things that do not look rational or strategic, okay? And I have to agree with him. And in fact, Jenner could tell you I've written on this, so I don't disagree with you. I mean, one response that I have is the response that I had to the gentleman here, which is to say it's part of the 25%, okay? It's a big part. The second thing is that, you know, there are a lot of people who believe that certain things I think are irrational are not irrational. So a lot of our economic behavior, many Republicans would argue, is not irrational, right? They think that, you know, I think that what George W. Bush, from a national security point and an economic point of view, did with the tax cuts and the budget deficits was not rational. But there are many people who disagree with that. So in a lot of cases, it's hard to distinguish rational from irrational behavior. But I would say that most of what we've done fits in the 25%. Final point I'd make to you, and this is the most important point, and it gets back to this young woman's question about unipolarity. Because the United States is so powerful, and because of our geographical location, remember we have fish on both sides of us. We're separated from Europe by about 4,000 miles, separated from Asia, China by about 8,000 miles. We've got countries like Canada, Mexico, Guatemala, Venezuela. I mean, we're so secure that we're free to go out and do stupid things and not have to worry about paying a significant price. You know what I'm saying? It's depressing. I'm not saying this is a good thing, but we are not just free to roam, we are free to misbehave. And we've done a lot of that. And it has hardly any strategic consequences. Right? We, in my opinion, are going to end up losing both the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. And there'll be a lot of people who say that this is catastrophic. It's not catastrophic. It's not going to matter very much at all. Because the security of the United States is guaranteed. We're just so powerful and so impervious to threats. I mean, pardon? What does it mean to lose California?
Well, California is like
Oh, well, that's a different issue, but that's not going to happen. Anyway, but good question. Yes?
Hello, Aylin Yardımcı, graduate student from here, Koç University. My question is, where do you fit non-state actors in your story or theory?
Yeah. Her question to me was, where do I fit non-state actors in my theory? The answer is, non-state actors have no place in my theory. Okay? They have no place. Well, because I believe that non-state actors are not very important. Again, I want to go back to talking about theory. When you come up with a theory of international politics, you have to simplify. You have to make assumptions about what you think is important and what you think is not important. And I am saying that states are the principal actors in international politics. And if you want to understand the broad contours and even a lot of the details of international politics, focusing on states alone is enough. The comeback from you is that occasionally non-state actors are really going to matter. Just like occasionally the Israel lobby matters. And in those cases, your theory is going to run into all sorts of trouble. The point I would make is that domestic politics, the point this gentleman raised, causes me a lot more trouble than non-state actors. I just don't think non-state actors matter very much. And on the subject of terrorism, I believe that the terrorist threat is greatly overrated in the United States. I think it's quite remarkable how we have blown the terrorist threat out of all proportion. So I just don't think non-state actors matter that much. And I would say to you that if you think non-state actors matter greatly, what you need to do is create a theory, a simple theory, where non-state actors get put up in bright.
Hi, my name is Jonathan Leader Maynard. I'm from the University of Oxford. I wanted to ask you a question about your third assumption, also on intentions, related to the earlier question. I entirely agree with your third assumption. States cannot be certain about the intentions of other states. I would add they can't be certain about capabilities either, but clearly intentions are more uncertain than capabilities, which presumably is what the content of that claim is. But clearly it doesn't follow from that that states don't make judgments about intentions at all. And it seems to me, therefore, that your argument about China must rest on a presumption that the benefits of power maximization outweigh any costs in terms of the intentions it would portray to other states. I.e., China doesn't think that power maximization will make it look aggressive, or look dangerous, or look like it has malign intentions to other states, right? Or at least not enough to outweigh the benefits of power maximization. And I wondered if you could justify that assumption to me. Why it is that the benefits of power maximization outweigh the potential costs in terms of what other states think about your intentions?
Yeah, I want to make a couple points. First of all, my starting assumption number 3, was that you cannot know the intentions of other states. And then when I take those 5 assumptions, including that third one, and put it in the mixer and hit the on switch, right, you end up in a situation where because you can't know the intentions of other states, you have to assume worst case. So you're in a system where everybody assumes that everybody else has evil intentions or malign intentions, and you have to behave aggressively to protect yourself, which means everybody ends up having malign intentions. This is the tragedy of great power politics. This is the undergirding of that phrase, the tragedy of great power politics. The tragedy of great power politics is you can have 2 countries that are satisfied with the status quo. They're satisfied with the status quo. But because they can't be certain what the intentions of the other state is, they compete with each other and they try to best the other state, which means they behave in malign ways. So everybody ends up with malign intentions. That's the tragedy of great power politics. Now, I think your second question is one that I often get, which is, to use my rhetoric, not yours, and tell me if this is correct. Isn't the story you're telling, John, sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy? In other words, if you assume worst-case intentions about the other side, don't you end up in a situation where you get a security competition with another country that might actually have benign intentions? Let's just take the China case. A number of people have said to me over time, John, if we follow your prescription, which is to contain China, then we're going to end up in a security competition with China, by definition. Isn't this a self-fulfilling prophecy? Wouldn't it be better to engage China, not to try to contain China, and operate on the assumption that maybe China has benign intentions, and we certainly have benign intentions, this is what most Americans think, and therefore we can live happily ever after. So let's avoid the self-fulfilling prophecy. My response to that is that my theory does represent a self-fulfilling prophecy. And this is another way of stating the tragedy of great power politics. We have no choice but to assume worst case about China, because if we assume that China is not going to be aggressive, and we don't try to contain China, and we guess wrong, and we're guessing here because we cannot be certain about intentions, if we guess wrong, it's like Germany. It's 1919. You ever think about what you would have done if you were at Versailles in 1919 with Germany? You're going to let Germany come back from the dead? No way I'm going to let Germany come back from the dead, ever. This is a huge state. It's got tremendous military capability. You just fought World War I against Germany. What are you going to do with Germany? What would you do with Germany if it's 1919 all over again? People say, oh, the problem is we had a Carthaginian peace. We should have been nice to the Germans. Yeah, you be nice to the Germans, and what happens if 20 years later they decide they want to do what they did in 1914 all over again? You can't tell me what German intentions will be. You can't tell me what Chinese intentions will be. So I simply have to assume worst case. So yes, it is a self-fulfilling prophecy, but what choice do I have? This is the tragedy of great power politics.
My name is Julien Vieillefond. I'm visiting in Coach. So my question for you would be how US are going to survive, since history tells us that all hegemonic system has collapsed. Roman Empire, Greek Empire, you are one of the last empires. So how are you going to maintain yourself?
His question is, how is the United States going to be able to maintain itself given that all previous empires or hegemons have declined? Well, the fact is that, as my mother used to say when I was a little boy, nothing is forever. And there's probably going to come a day when planet Earth disappears. I will be long gone, and you will be long gone by that point. We hope. Yes. But nothing is forever. The question you have to ask yourself is, how much staying power does the United States have? I actually believe the United States has huge staying power. I think a good case can be made that China will not continue to rise. And if China does not continue to rise, we will be more powerful relative to the rest of the world in 2050 than we are today. More powerful, largely for demographic reasons. The American population is increasing. Population of China is in real trouble because of the one-child policy. Japan is the most rapidly aging population in the world. The Europeans stopped making babies long ago, and their day in the sun is long gone, right? Coming to Europe is like going to a museum. Right? So we're in very good shape. The only country that can give us a run for our money is China. And I'm not saying China won't give us a run for our money, but it's not clear that they will. And if China does not give us a run for our money, we will be, again, more powerful in 2050 relative to everybody else than we are now. And just think about all the trouble that we'll cause then. Because we'll be even more secure and more able to do foolish things and not pay a significant price. But I would say, for as far as the eye can see, we're in pretty good shape, if not very good shape. I don't think that means that, you know, we're going to last forever, because again, nobody's going to last forever.
Thank you very much for the extremely interesting and inspiring talk. This is Şuhnaz Yılmaz from Koç University. Two questions, one at the theoretical level. In terms of linking domestic and international aspects, what is your assessment of Robert Putnam's logic of two-level games, making this analogy of statesmen playing chess at two simultaneous tables, international and domestic politics? And one more practical question. How does regional powers fit into this picture beyond the hegemons and aspiring regional powers like Turkey? What should be their strategy?
The first question had to do with how do I think about two-level games as laid out by Robert Putnam. And this is an attempt to integrate both domestic politics and international politics into a single theory. I have a number of friends who have come up with IR theories that fit that description. My good friend Jack Snyder wrote this book, Myths of Empire, which has a realist component to it and a domestic politics component to it. And Jack can tell you that under these conditions, the international component applies, and under these conditions, the domestic component applies. And as many of you know, Kenneth Waltz has a theory of international politics, and he says, my theory is not a theory of foreign policy, because this theory of foreign policy would have to be a theory of domestic politics. And in a very important way, what Waltz is saying is that you have to combine domestic politics with international politics to come up with a comprehensive theory. I, on the other hand, have a simple theory that privileges international politics and pays little attention to domestic politics, okay? And it's just a different theory. The problem I have with theories like Jack Snyder's theory, without going into the details, is that once you introduce domestic politics into the theory, it becomes a more complicated theory. You move away from simplicity, from parsimony. And I think that you then begin to run into all sorts of problems. But there's no question that if you have a theory that includes domestic politics and international politics and throws in non-state actors, the more factors you throw in, the more that that theory will account for reality. But the problem is that once you have a theory that has lots of factors in it, it's really not much of a theory, it's just a description of reality. So I tend not to like the Putnam, Snyder, even Waltz approach. And I tend to like my simple approach, and some people may say simplistic approach, that privileges structure. With regard to regional actors, I think my usual response to this is, look, my theory is essentially a theory of great power politics. It's called Tragedy of Great Power Politics. Obviously deals with great powers. It's not easy to explain how it applies in particular regional situations. But for a country like Turkey or a country like Israel in the Middle East, the theory applies very neatly, because realist logic is clearly at play in the Middle East. My co-author of the Israel Lobby book, Steve Walt, who teaches at Harvard, wrote a book where he laid out his realist theory, which is called balance of threat theory. And the empirical part of the book is taking his realist theory and applying it to the Middle East. So I think you can take my theory, Steve's theory, Jack Snyder, Ken Waltz, and you could apply it to the Middle East. I don't think the theory is going to be very useful for explaining Belgium or smaller countries in Asia, right, that just don't have much maneuver room. But for other sort of regions of the world where there's no great power like the United States or Germany physically located there, I think the theory can tell you a great deal. And I think a good realist theory, whether it's mine or someone else's, will tell you a lot. Not everything by any means, but tell you a lot about Turkey. I was telling some people yesterday that being a realist in the United States is a tough sell, because although the United States usually behaves in realist ways, its self-image is very liberal. But I was telling people that the 4 countries in the world where I feel very at home, because there's a powerful appreciation of realism, are number 1, China, number 2, Greece, number 3, Denmark, amazingly, and number 4, Turkey. And I was actually amazed the first time I went to Greece at how realist the Greeks are. And by the way, it's in large part because of Turkey. But you go to Greece and there's a very healthy appreciation of Realism 101. And of course, I think the same thing is true in Turkey. That's not to say for one second that everyone you run into in Turkey is a realist and everyone thinks that I'm smart or anything like that. It's just to say that there is deep down in Turkish culture, I believe, and in Greek culture, and certainly in Chinese culture, a healthy appreciation for realism. And I think that's because realist logic has long been at play in this neighborhood. Sir.
Tahir Klaus, grad student of International Relations here at Koç University. My question is about the basis of thesis on regional hegemon. Yes, a regional hegemon doesn't want another regional hegemon and doesn't want a peer competitor and try to prevent it, even acting in harmony with other regional powers. It's okay and it's rational for today, but do you think that is it also rational for the future, considering the unintended consequences? Like in the Nazi Germany case, United States made a partnership with Soviet Union to overcome Nazi Germany and paved the way for the emergence of another giant. And vice versa in the Chinese case. I mean, China is now competing with will probably compete with the United States and will probably make partnership with Russia in this competition. And do you think if one day China and Russia overcome United States, they will be as partners as today? And what will be the future of these relations?
Your first point was that for the United States to defeat Nazi Germany in World War II, it had to form a close alliance with the Soviet Union. And in the process of defeating Nazi Germany, you guarantee a situation where the Soviet Union would end up as the most powerful state in Europe by far, and then the United States would have to spend the entire Cold War containing the Soviet Union. That's his point. It's an excellent description of reality, and it just tells you that in international politics, you often run into situations where there is no attractive solution for dealing with the problem. George Kennan said in his famous lectures at the University of Chicago, which were published as a book called American Diplomacy, that the United States had 2 choices in the 1930s. It could either side with Germany against the Soviet Union, in which case Germany would then be the dominant power in Europe, and we'd have to contain Germany, or the United States could could ally with the Soviet Union and defeat Germany, in which case we would have to then deal with the Soviet Union, which is what happened. But either way, as Ken had pointed out, we were going to end up, when that war ended, having to deal with either Nazi Germany or the Soviet Union, because there would be nobody else around to contain that country. And that's what happened. And we decided, quite correctly, that as evil as the Soviet Union was, Nazi Germany was even worse. So we formed an alliance with the Soviet Union. And after defeating Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan, we ended up in a Cold War that took place not only in Europe but in Asia as well. But it was unavoidable. It's just the world that we were presented with. Now, with regard to your second question, this had to do with China and Russia forming an alliance against the United States. I do not believe that that's going to happen. I believe that the Russians will join with the United States and China's other neighbors to contain China. I think this is sort of balance of power politics 101. I may be proved wrong, as I said before, sometimes that happens. But I think in this case, we don't have to worry much about that. Yes?
My name is Sarpil. I am a PhD student here at Koç University. Yesterday and today you said that it is not so realistic to listen Israeli lobby for American politics. And is it because of your belief that Israel is not a regional power in the Middle East, or you don't see Israel as a future potential regional power in the Middle East?
Well, when you talk about Israel and the United States, it's important to remember that when the United States goes to war in the Middle East, Israel is never an ally. Because of the politics of the Middle East, we can't fight side by side with Israel. In other words, in 1991, when we fought the first Gulf War, we went to enormous lengths to make sure that Israel did not get involved in the war, because we were afraid that it would shatter the coalition. In the 2003 war against Iraq, we did not include Israel. We do not use Israel as an aircraft carrier in the region. It's not like we station forces there and that's a major American base. So Israel in no way is a strategic asset to the United States in the Middle East. It just isn't. And a lot of that has to do with the politics of the Middle East. And furthermore, I would note that the Israelis would prefer to operate on their own. The Israelis understand that it's a self-help system and they want to not be dependent on the Americans. So what the Israelis want from the United States is lots of material support, lots of diplomatic support. But they're not asking the United States to protect them. So Israel is not in any way a strategic asset for the United States. At the same time, because Israel's policies against the Palestinians cause us so much trouble, Israel ends up being a strategic liability for the United States. Barack Obama and his predecessors, George W. Bush, Bill Clinton, and George H.W. Bush, all went to great lengths to create a two-state solution because they understand that the Palestinian situation is disastrous for U.S. Middle East policy. It's just terrible. But we can't get the Israelis to stop colonizing the West Bank. And the end result of that is that Israel becomes a strategic liability. You remember what I said to you about Khalid Sheikh Mohammed yesterday? Khalid Sheikh Mohammed said that his animus towards the United States had little to do with American culture or American values or his experience in America as a student. What infuriated Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, who was the principal architect of the 9/11 attacks, was America's support of Israel's policies towards the Palestinians. And as I said yesterday, we know that Osama bin Laden was motivated in good part by his anger at the United States for supporting Israel's policies towards the Palestinians. So in this sense, Israel is a liability for the United States. So I think on balance, you can't make the argument that we need Israel in any meaningful strategic way to do business in the Middle East.
This is Serhat Güven. Just to shift the focus of debate away from intentions to capabilities, what does your theory say about the role of nuclear weapons in the upcoming competition or geopolitical rivalry between the United States and China?
The question was, I've not said anything about nuclear weapons and what role would nuclear weapons play, according to my theory, in a security competition between the United States and China. An interesting question. I think that nuclear weapons make a war between China and the United States much less likely. I think there is no question that nuclear weapons are a huge force for peace. And they're a huge force for peace because if you have two countries that have nuclear weapons, they want to go to great lengths to make sure they don't get in a war with each other for fear that it'll escalate to the nuclear level, and we all know what happens then. Just go back to the Cold War. The United States and the Soviet Union both had huge nuclear arsenals. A war in Europe, World War III in Europe, involving the Soviets and their allies on one side and the Americans and their allies on the other side, would have been World War III, possibly with nuclear weapons. That threat was enough to make both sides remarkably cautious in how they dealt with each other. Nuclear weapons, because they're weapons of mass destruction, make states very cautious. And nuclear weapons therefore make war less likely. All of this is to say that the presence of nuclear weapons in the hands of the Chinese and in the hands of the Americans makes war less likely. But let me qualify that argument by describing how the Cold War is different than what a security competition between the United States and China will look like, and why that security competition between China and the United States is more likely to lead to war than was the case during the Cold War. During the Cold War, the US-Soviet competition was centered on Europe. It was centered on what we call the Central Front, the intra-German border. And everyone feared that if war broke out between NATO and the Warsaw Pact, between the United States and the Soviet Union, it would break out in Europe, and it would be World War III with nuclear weapons. That thought was so horrible that when we ran war games during the Cold War, it was impossible to get a war started in Europe. Everybody understand? When we ran war games, we could not get a war started in Europe because the decision makers who were playing the Soviet side or the Warsaw Pact side and the American side were so skittish about the crisis escalating that they did everything they could to dampen the not exacerbated. Okay? Now, let's talk about the situation in a China-US competition. The geography is very different. There is no central front, right? So there's no threat of World War III with nuclear weapons in the middle of Europe or in the middle of Asia. Instead, the conflict scenarios that we worry about in Asia take place over the South China Sea, the Senkaku or Diaoyu Islands that are in dispute between Japan and China, Taiwan, the Korean Peninsula. These are all situations where you can imagine a war breaking out because the stakes are not the same as they were during the Cold War. There are a number of people who I know quite well, who are quite reasonable, who believe that there's a good chance that the Japanese and the Chinese could end up shooting each other in the next year or two over the Senkaku or the Diaoyu Islands. It's a very dangerous situation. The situation in the South China Sea is very dangerous. What if North Korea implodes? What if North Korea implodes and the South Koreans decide that they're going to unify Korea? And the South Koreans cross the 38th parallel. Well, you understand the South Koreans are joined at the hip with the United States. Last time we crossed the 38th parallel was in 1950. I don't know how many of you know this, but during the Korean War, which we Americans fought from 1950 to 1953, we were not fighting against the North Koreans, we were fighting against the Chinese. Because when we crossed the 38th parallel and started moving north, we were heading towards the Yalu River, which was China's border with North Korea. The Chinese sent a clear signal to us, don't come near this border, or we'll come in. They came in. And we spent 3 years fighting the Chinese. Well, what if you have a situation where North Korea melts down, the South Koreans move north to unify Korea? Don't you think the Chinese are going to see this as evidence that the Americans are marching up to the Yalu River once again? Now, we may be able to avoid a conflict with the Chinese. In fact, I think we would avoid a conflict with the Chinese. But am I highly confident of that? No. Am I highly confident that we can avoid a conflict over Taiwan? I have good realist friends, 2 good realist friends, who basically argue that we should give Taiwan to China and say we're not defending Taiwan. And the reason they say we should give up on Taiwan is they just think it's so dangerous. It's a hot-button issue, right? They argue that there was no issue during the Cold War that caused as much trouble as Taiwan will in a future US-China competition. And therefore, it just makes sense to take the issue off the table. Tell China we are not going to fight for Taiwan. Taiwan belongs to them. Right? Now, I'm not saying that we should do that, but all I'm telling you is that just gives you a feel for how, even though we live in a nuclear world, you could still get a conflict between China and the United States, or China and one of its neighbors that then pulled in the United States.
Thank you very much for your speech. I'm Damla Cengiz, PhD student from Sabancı University. How would you explain cooperation between states in soft politics in order to decrease the risks of security dilemma? Because we have the example of the creation of the European Union between France and Germany, economic cooperation, and also between Greece and Turkey. The rapprochement period that you have mentioned, realism was very effective, but now we don't talk about this balance of power, actually threat between Greece and Turkey. How would you explain the role of this cooperation in soft power politics? Thank you very much.
Well, first of all, any realist theory has room in it for cooperation. states do cooperate. The realist argument is that even when there's cooperation, however, deep down under, right, there's the potential for conflict, and it's that potential for conflict that dominates everything else. But you can still have lots of cooperation. The example I like to use to highlight this is that as a result of the von Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact in August 1939, the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany engaged in all sorts of economic intercourse. And between August 1939 and June 22nd, 1941, when the Nazis invaded the Soviet Union, there was a great deal of economic interchange. And in fact, when the panzers were going into the Soviet Union, there were German trains running side by side with them, taking goods into the Soviet Union, and there was material coming in the other direction as well. So you can have economic cooperation and still have conflict, right? So realism has no problems with that. I think the more important question you ask is, just to pick one of your examples, France and Germany, right? Or the European Union more generally. Why is Western Europe so peaceful today? Isn't this a basic threat to my theory? Does it undermine my theory? And my answer is no. And my argument is that the reason you have peace in Europe is because the United States remains in Europe, and the United States sits on top of the West Europeans. The reason the French don't have to worry about the Germans, and the Germans don't have to worry about the French, is the Americans are there. You know, when the Cold War ended, we did not go home. And you have not asked us to go home. The Europeans have not said, America, go home. Not a single European leader has ever pushed us to leave. And in fact, every European leader worries that we will leave. This is the pivot to Asia. As I like to say to people, if you pivot to Asia, you have to pivot away from some area. Where are we going to pivot away from? My view is we're going to pivot away from Europe. And most European leaders understand that. They do not want us to leave. Why don't they want us to leave? Why aren't the French saying to the Americans, you know, the French don't really like the Americans that much? Why aren't they telling the Americans to go home? Why aren't the Germans telling us to go home? Why aren't the Poles telling us to go home? Why isn't anybody telling us to go home? Because we are the pacifier. Getting back to that woman's question from before, we live in a unipolar world. The United States is an incredibly powerful country. And as such, when it stays in a place like Europe, it serves as a pacifier. So it's the presence of NATO that accounts for peace in Europe. I would ask you, what do you think will happen with the Germans if the Americans leave and NATO is dismantled? The Germans will then have to provide for their own security. I want to see how the French react when the Germans begin to take care of their own security. It'll make them very, very nervous. It'll make everybody very, very nervous. But they don't have to do that. Because we provide security for the Germans. This is why the Germans don't have to spend any money on defense. It's why they don't need nuclear weapons. Because Uncle Sam provides nuclear deterrence for them. Why do the Poles, why do the East Europeans want us to expand NATO eastward? Why do they want us to put America's security umbrella over their head? Because they understand we are the pacifier. So if we leave, then I believe it'll be a very different world. Yeah.
In your narrative about the rise of the US as a regional hegemon, you exclude Great Britain and Britain's role in the exchange of hegemony, particularly in the early 20th century. Okay, the United States defeated Imperial Japan and Imperial Germany, but also took over institutions of hegemony from Great Britain. And does that dynamic make made no contribution to your theory and your predictions about the future relationship between the United States and China?
No, don't think that. Get me out of that just for a second. I want you to explain to me, how was Britain a hegemon? Where and when was Britain a hegemon?
Mid-19th century. I mean,
what about France? What about Russia?
Well,
what about Germany?
Well, Britain controlled the high seas and
it didn't control the land. It didn't control the land.
So, in your definition of hegemony, Great Britain does not count as one. Am I correct?
No, there was no hegemony. No, but I want to know why your definition was a hegemony.
Because she controlled the seas, and she served as a clearinghouse for world trade, and she maintained the largest colonial empire.
Yeah, but I wouldn't argue that made Britain a hegemon. For me, you have to dominate either your region of the world or you have to dominate the entire globe.
Well, the peculiarity of Britain